I've had enough of fine words over the years. I don't want to hear how sorry people are and how marvellous the community is. I want a timeline, and I want somebody overseeing that timeline to make sure that things happen.
The truth that this inquiry reveals is how, as a society, we value the lives of some people more than others.
The assumption is you're a social housing tenant, take what you're given and be grateful. How do you change that is absolutely key, in my view, to going forward and making sure this doesn't happen again.
Do you feel that there is anything different about the way that government is looking at the report? Mm-hmm. Do you have any grounds for optimism? Hello and welcome to the Political Fourcast. The Grenfell Inquiry into the tower block fire that killed 72 people has delivered a devastating final report that names and shames many. Inept government, out-of-touch local authority, weak regulators, manufacturers that were systematically dishonest. Its language and its power may have surprised even the most sceptical of campaigners. But it has taken years, and it has delayed justice for the families, with prosecutions only now on the agenda, maybe. That justice delayed and denied has been a familiar theme recently, from the infected blood scandal, the post office, COVID, inquiries time and again revealing what's rotten about our core institutions, and yet we keep finding new failings. How will a new government make any difference to all of this? I'm joined by Emma Dent Coad, who was the local MP at the time of the Grenfell fire and now sits on Kensington and Chelsea Council. Deborah Coles is Director of Inquest, who campaign on deaths involving state institutions. And our own Jackie Long is here, who has covered Grenfell and all its fallout since day one. And let's try and move away from the news, because in truth, now that the report is out, the news is really that everyone's digesting it. The government's saying it will come back in 6 months with its proposals. The police and CPS will now get to work on looking at what they can do. But I just kind of want to begin with all of you. When you step back after this 7 years, what do you think yesterday reveals? Jackie?
There's something slightly strange about it in terms of talking about reveal, because the families say they've known this all along. So they have waited 7 years to be told what they always felt: their loved ones should not have died, that their deaths were entirely avoidable, and that they were the result of systemic failure, disregard, them being treated like second-class citizens. Now, what was interesting talking to the bereaved yesterday, and really powerful and actually quite upsetting at points, is you got the sense that even though they knew it, seeing it in black and white, now they'd waited a long time for this, but seeing it in black and white in an official document, hearing the chair of the inquiry tell them what they knew, was still overwhelming for them. They were grateful for it, I think. They were cynical about what the report would deliver. But I found people who had, every time I'd spoken to them, held it together, really struggling yesterday. They found it a very, very difficult day. A day when the inquiry report did deliver, but those conclusions were still very, very hard for them to hear.
Yes, I mean, Emma, this was about cladding and building regulations and supervision and lying and all of those things, but it's about a lot more than that as well, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I mean, when you step back from it, what do you think this whole process is revealing about Britain?
Well, it's obviously what happened was part of the process of austerity and squeezing funding on absolutely everything, value engineering, making everything as cheap as possible, while, as we know, the big corporations were making outrageous profits, as they still are. We have to really look at the whole system. People say housing is broken, we need to fix it. It's not just one thing, it's 100 things. And I've been working for numerous professional organisations over the years in my role as a built environment journalist. And they are all ready to work with government. They're ready to work with government, and they need the people who will actually listen, because in my brief tenure as MP, none of them wanted to listen, neither the secretaries of state nor the ministers. I really hope now we have people who will listen, not fine words. I've had enough of fine words over the years. I don't want to hear how sorry people are and how marvellous the community is. I want a timeline, and I want somebody overseeing that timeline to make sure that things happen. There are 600,000 people around the country living in unsafe homes, and they need to see some action from the new government.
So when you say people didn't want to listen. What do you mean by that? They didn't want to listen to what?
They honestly didn't even believe some of the things I was saying. I said, there are people sleeping in parks. They go, no, there aren't. I said, yeah, there are people sleeping in parks. I know there are because I'm talking to them. This was literally in the days and weeks afterwards. And they just denied my experience. I live there. I'm part of that community. People talk to me all the time. I know what's going on. And I'm still very much connected, obviously, because I'm still there.
Yeah. That was families from the Tower, was it?
Yeah, exactly. And people who live nearby. And people who are terrified.
People who were scared to go back into their
Absolutely.
house, yeah.
And that distrust of authority is still there, deeply embedded. They don't think the council has changed, and we are waiting to see what the government will do, apart from fine words. And we did have fine words, but let's see some action now and oversight of that.
Deborah, what do you think it's revealed? Because there was huge scepticism about this inquiry, this man to lead it over the years. You probably shared some of that.
Indeed.
What do you, now you've got the report. What do you think?
I mean, I think the first thing for me, the truth that this inquiry reveals is how, as a society, we value the lives of some people more than others. And I think the truth that this inquiry spoke was about how working class, black and racialised communities in particular, and those in social housing, are really not, Emma's already said, not listened to, but were completely ignored by those who had or should have protected their right to life effectively. It was an extremely strong report with some devastating conclusions, but in a way we did know this. And I think Jackie's absolutely right that, families are not one homogenous group. And so for different families, that report will mean different things. But I do think that a lot of the families there yesterday recognised the importance of that truth being in black and white, in a publicly available report, exposing the corporate greed, the negligence, the criminality that resulted in those preventable deaths. I think the gruesome reminder in Grenfell was, of course, the Lakanal house fire, where a coroner presided over an inquest into 6 deaths, made very clear evidence-based recommendations for change, and yet government treated that report with utter contempt and complacency. Had it taken that seriously, we may well not have had Grenfell. And I think for me, what the truth that this report speaks is the fact that unless we have proper transparency and oversight of recommendations that come out of these inquiries, then we are likely to see these cycles repeat.
That's the trouble, Jackie. You have the delightful job of covering many of these inquiries, and the people aren't then put in charge in any meaningful way of making sure that the inquiry isn't just an inquiry that's, that goes. It becomes it's vaguely the Secretary of State, but it kind of dribbles away. So I know you've been speaking to Angela Rayner as well about this. So do you get any sense that this government is any different?
Well, I want to talk just briefly, if I can, about that issue of listening, because not listening is almost like a motif throughout this whole story. Whether it was the tenants making complaints about problems that they had in the tower in the first place, whether it was the council failing to listen to them when they were out on the streets, had no food, had no clothes. I met a young man on day 2 who had been forced to go across town. He'd been asked to come to them to get an Oyster card and to get other things that he needed. Nobody went out to the people who were stuck in hotels because nobody understood, nobody was listening to what they needed. And then you go on to governments who don't listen to the recommendations of reports that could have gone on to save people's lives. And that plays out, I think, in the inquiries that follow often in terms of who is listening. Even if you get an inquiry, and I think this is one, where those involved think, you have heard us. Because you've heard us, you've named those companies, you have shamed those companies, you have named the government, successive governments. But the question now is, there is still cynicism about whether anyone delivers. Now, Angela Rayner, I think, is an interesting Secretary of State because she was brought up in social housing, and there are remarkably few people in positions of authority who have any knowledge of social housing at all. So you would hope and expect her to get perhaps a greater sense of what this story is all about. I talked to her about this idea that the tenants felt from the get-go and throughout that they were second-class citizens. And she said, this holds up a mirror to our society. And she said that she was angry about how council tenants or social housing tenants were viewed in this case. And she says her timeline is full of exactly what we were told again and again at Grenfell Tower by the people who lived in it, that if they asked for anything, i.e. some repairs to be done, the assumption is you're a social housing tenant. I always call it council tenant. I'm old enough to remember when they were called that. Take what you're given and be grateful. And she says her timeline is full of people who say that about asylum seekers and social housing tenants. How do you change that is absolutely key, in my view, to going forward and making sure this doesn't happen again.
Yeah. For the record, I got into active politics after my 5-year battle with my housing association when a ceiling collapsed, narrowly missing my daughter's head. And if she hadn't been sitting in a high back chair, she could have been killed. I had 5 years. I can speak English beautifully. I'm articulate. I'm determined. I can be quite tough. It still took me 5 years to get any sense of justice when they actually admitted fault and fixed the ceiling and so on, and then left me in peace. That was the point at which I thought, well, I can do this myself. I should do this for other people. And I've been fighting that battle over and over again for other people who are treated absolutely abominably. I will never forget, there was one man, he was semi-literate, English guy, and he was the sweetest person looking after his mum in her council home. And the housing officers laughed at him because he couldn't fill in the forms.
So do you think those attitudes
shocking
towards social housing tenants are still the same today?
Unfortunately, I've
Take
never
what you're
seen
given
one
and
that
don't
bad.
complain.
Yeah, exactly. They still somehow think that they, that they're in charge. There's no sense of service. I say, you
And
do
why can't
realise
you
that you
change
are
that as a
working for this
council?
gentleman. Yeah, well, this is what you try. I've been saying this for years
Well,
and years and
explain
years.
why you're a powerless voice then. on that
Yeah,
front.
because, of course, at Kensington and Chelsea Council, anybody who's not a Tory, whatever we vote on in council, we can have fantastic debates with brilliant speeches. But when it comes to a vote, we're always outvoted. Somehow we should have more of a say in what is going on there.
But this
And they
is not
should listen
really
to
about the
us.
Conservative politicians, is it, on the council? It's about the people who work for the council, who are just ordinary people.
It is
They
actually.
are just council
it is
employees,
both.
civil
No,
servants.
it is actually both, because I've had some terrible instances of blatant contempt, actually, publicly in council meetings. You'd be very surprised and shocked, actually. But and that has to change.
Where do you think that contempt comes from? Because it was summed up quite nicely in the report
Yeah.
when they said that the council, and particularly the tenant management organisation, which was charged with looking after Grenfell Tower, responding to the tenants, could not relate to the tenants it was taking rent from.
Exactly.
Could not relate to the people who
Exactly.
lived
The number
in
of times
tower.
I said,
Now,
"Do you remember that you work for us? You work for us. You know that. You work for the tenants, and we work for the tenants, and the council works for the tenants. I don't work for the council. I work for the tenants, and so do you. Your job is to work for them and look after them and keep them safe. And it's a class thing. It's partly a race thing, definitely, in some cases. But that comes from the top. And actually, some of the things I read about the chief exec of the TMO at the time, I was there for some of it, and I'd certainly met him numerous times. I was shocked at what I read. I knew it was bad. I didn't know it was that bad.
Deborah?
Well, I was just going to say, I think, look at politicians. Many of us were there when Eric Pickles gave evidence. And what was his primary concern when he gave his evidence to the inquiry? His very busy diary. And he was utterly contemptuous of the inquiry, the bereaved and survivors who were sitting there. And this goes to to the highest level of government, but also corporate bodies. And one of the things I've been quite struck by at the inquiry is counsel to the inquiry when he described the merry-go-round of buck passing, and the fact that a lot of people treated that inquiry as being about reputation management, covering their arses, for want of a better word, and not being there to assist with truth, accountability, and trying to effect change. For me, it was reminiscent of many of the inquests and inquiries that I've observed, particularly Hillsborough, and why it is that Hillsborough families are so passionate about ensuring that we have a Hillsborough law, a legal duty of candour, so that people have to tell the truth.
But is it any wonder that these become arse-covering exercises and sort of shifting the blame exercises when the conversation the day after yesterday's reports in the media is not really about how we prevent this from happening again and what we do to sort of solve the systems. It's about sending people to jail. It's about the thirst for blame. And everyone knows that's what's going to happen. So it's no wonder that the whole process is going to be.
And that is important for the families.
Yeah,
really important for them.
But for me, of course, those responsible need to be held to account. But for me, and what families tell Inquest on a daily basis is, yes, they want the truth, they want justice, but more than anything, they want to stop the same thing happening to somebody else. And that is why we've got to have a far better mechanism for ensuring oversight of recommendations, publicly, transparent accountability for all those who have responsibility for ensuring that recommendations are implemented, and that needs to be a process that can help drive the cultural change that you've been talking about. And it shouldn't be, the onus should not be on bereaved families and campaigners to drive that cultural change. It should be there, and it should be open for everybody to see.
Jackie, some of the families didn't want the inquiry, did they? They wanted prosecutions first.
I think, as Deborah says, they're not a homogenous group, and people have been divided over what should happen from the very, very beginning. I think some families felt that they were blindsided by Theresa May announcing this inquiry so quickly. There was some cynicism that it was a deflection from, had those terrible footage of her arriving, not speaking to the bereaved, being hurtled into a car, running away looking panicked, looking again like someone who couldn't relate to the people on the ground. But the inquiry was announced really, really quickly. And some of the families have argued that it was never explained to us what an inquiry was. It was never explained to us how the inquiry would work, what it would deliver for us, And of course, they feel that the inquiry has delayed justice by 7 years. Now,
I think one of the things, again, for me, that comes out of this process is that these processes take far too long. And people don't understand how traumatizing they are and how re-traumatizing they are. And I think one of the things I want to talk to this government about is to have a proper discussion about how we deal with traumatic bereavement and state-related deaths, so that we don't force families into years and years of having to fight for that truth and for accountability and for change, and recognizing that actually there is a very important public interest in making these processes a lot quicker, because ultimately what we need to see is that change happening. And if you have delayed processes, you said it's justice delayed is justice denied. And that applies not just to holding individuals or corporations to account, but also to try and ensure the change.
But can it be, quick, speeded up?
I think government are very good at trying to use public inquiries as a way to kind of quash anger and frustration. I think obviously that this inquiry had COVID in the middle, but I do think if you had a legal duty of candour where people had to tell the truth, and you had people accepting their responsibility. You could have speedier justice. You could reduce the time that inquiries take. I also think that, one of the areas that I think was not properly explored within the public inquiry was the question of race and racism, and the question properly of social housing, which a lot of us argued should have been in the terms of reference. So I think this is a strong report, but there are areas that are weak.
And when you talk about the state dealing with bereaved people, and I suppose it's not just bereaved people, it's people who are ruined as well from other,
systemic
whether it's the post
injustice
office or systemic injustice, yes. I mean, what would you do to make the state treat people better?
There has to be a whole new system, as Deborah's suggesting, for people in that situation. The number of people who said, not only related to Grenfell, but all around the country, because I'm connected with a lot of these campaign groups around the country, and our cladding scandal all over the country, and other fire safety issues. There's 600,000 people out there, who, many of whom, it's a full-time job. The Grenfell bereaved and survivors, many of them, this is their job, fighting for justice. And the same for the people out there, many of whom have invested their life savings and their parents' life savings in a home which is now worth nothing. It's suddenly become a full-time job, and that's it. Their lives are finished now. They're done. If they get justice in the end, they're going to be so held back in their lives, they may be traumatized forever. So, there's a whole generation of people whose lives are not only on hold, but they're in a constant state of anxiety. And as I say, working for justice. And there has to be a system that actually steps in to support them.
And the big question is whether Labour can deliver, because the families pointedly a number of times talked about the Labour government to us, the Labour government, they kept reminding us, this new Labour government. And of course, Keir Starmer's speech in the House yesterday was very powerful, and he apologised.
And Jackie, what about when that statement was made, the number of MPs who left?
Awful. That was shocking.
I mean, and that, you see, that really was chilling to me, because of all the statements that you would have thought the House would be full over, would be the Grenfell Tower statement. And in a way, that also goes back to your earlier question about what does the truth look like for Grenfell? And that is also about the responsibility of parliamentarians for ignoring these issues for decades.
I think we return all the time to the value of people and to who matters, and to the idea that this is a story that has moved on, and tying that in with how we treat bereaved people and the fact that they have to keep campaigning. Yeah. I mean, woe is me, but as a journalist, I hate having to go back and say to them, can we speak to a family member? Yeah. But we have to, because that reminds people, this happened to us. Yeah. We lost our family, we lost our home, we lost our community. But the issue around value of people who live in social housing, for me, is one of the most critical things that Angela Rayner says as Deputy Prime Minister she understands. But unless you change it, unless you give more value to the people living in those places, you can still have councils, and we know it happens up and down the country, who, when the tenant phones, or has to go through the torturous process to complain, ain't no one answering. And they're not coming quickly, because there's still this idea. And the people at Grenfell told me this a lot, that you're getting this for free. Yeah. Now the rent you're paying is almost, it's almost as if you're not paying any rent.
They're told they should feel gratitude.
And it remains to be seen whether Angela Rayner can really change very much, because she herself is discounted and not listened to, in part because she's working class, because she grew up in social housing, because she speaks with an accent, all those sorts of things.
Yeah, exactly.
And it counts, in a sense, it's something that people want to talk to her or talk about her, because she's so rare. And the point about representation, and it's a bit of a cliche, but the thing is, the council, the TMO, you can't relate to your tenants because you know nothing about what it's like to live in social housing. Yeah. At cabinet level over the last 20 years, say, I'd be really interested to find out how many people have any experience of living in social housing.
I think this cabinet is slightly different.
This cabinet is.
There is more
will we see change as a result of that?
And we'll see whether anything changes. But I mean, the problem this government also has is that, right now, in the middle of any crisis, that is their priority, it seems. But the truth is, the priority for housing in Britain is not dealing with the cladding on tower blocks, it's building houses and unlocking planning permission. And that's what that government department's priority is going to be. So the question is, how high does this stay on the agenda?
Yeah, if they don't deal with all the other issues that there are, we're going to have another generation of buildings which aren't safe, I'm afraid to say. We have very poor construction standards now. Housing has got more and more expensive to build because of Brexit. The government has to commit more money than they want to spend if you want proper homes.
What's really, really critical is successive governments always talk about building more homes.
Yeah.
But how many of those homes will actually be social homes? And I don't mean affordable homes because they're different things.
Social rent.
And a social rent, like the old council houses. And just to say that one of the things that I think is really, has been exposed by Grenfell is, after the war, to get a council house or a social house was like winning the golden ticket in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, because it was taking you out of slums. They were a better quality build, if you were lucky enough to get one. Over time, somehow, our view of being in social housing has now changed to an almost entirely negative thing. That people who remain in social houses are losers who haven't been able to buy their own home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, after Thatcher's right to buy, I mean, that all fed into that whole kind of narrative, didn't it? But I don't see that. My understanding is Labour have not committed to building more social housing.
No, they haven't.
I mean, and the difference between affordable and social, I think
it's critical.
It's absolutely critical.
But you don't change the attitude unless you change the. You can build these houses, but the right to buy, for example, further exacerbated. I'm not saying it was all rosy and tenants were treated brilliantly prior to that, but it exacerbated this idea that you were successful if you managed to buy your own home. Mm-hmm. And if you couldn't even afford to buy your own council home, well, and I think that has subtly played out into the responses from councils, from tenant management organisations to just wait and get what you're given when we're ready.
Thatcher opened the doors to corporate greed, and actually the report actually states that, so it's not some crazy lefty saying that. But they opened the doors
but
to...
it's also about what the aim of government is in housing, isn't it? In the post-war, the role of government was to provide housing for people who didn't have houses.
Yes.
Governments these days of all complexions do not really see it as their job to house people, and they want to create the conditions in which houses are bought or rented, by people, rather than, what was going on half a century ago.
Yeah.
That's not going to change, is it? I mean, in a way you'd think it ought to, because, young people can't afford to rent or buy. And so you need a new generation of social housing for people who aren't
if you invest in social housing, that has huge effects on health, better education, educational standards, life outcomes, and so on. It's a real investment in human beings. That's what it is. You're not just putting a roof over somebody's head if you give them a good, secure home they can afford. You're actually affecting their entire life, health, education, and their economic capabilities, actually. So, it should be seen as that.
And of course,
it's an investment.
We have a massive issue around homelessness and the consequences of that. I mean, I think, the other thing is, of course, that across the country, people are living in fear on a daily basis, having seen, Grenfell, but then Dagenham 2 weeks ago. And, I think the government, if anything is going to kind of force them to act, and particularly act on the recommendations of this report, you would hope it would be that reality, because, what would be more catastrophic than seeing the loss of life after a disaster like this, and a preventable one at that?
Well, then just finally, as we come to the end, let me ask you all, how positive you feel about this process now. The inquiry's over, the next process begins.
Yeah.
Do you feel that there is anything different about the way these conclusions are being looked at, the way that government is looking at the report, or likely to treat any other reports? Do you have any grounds for optimism? I'd
say the jury's out. Obviously, I have some more hope that a Labour government would have more affinity with the issues that have come up, rather than just thinking, oh, how can we get another chunk of money off to our corporate pals over dinner, which was certainly going on a lot, as we know, in the last government. I don't think that will be happening. I mean, it has to be. This has to change. If it doesn't change, if this doesn't change things, they will be voted out next time around. So for better or worse, they have to make this change. And if they want me to advise them, I'm happy to do so, but probably don't. But it has to. But the jury's out, definitely.
Deborah, I mean, if you were called in and asked to advise, what would you say?
I mean, I would happily advise, because what I want to see Hillsborough law. I want to see a national oversight mechanism so that we can properly monitor the impact of this inquiry and its recommendations. I also want to try and ensure that we have a better way of supporting bereaved people when, something like this happens. The test of this report will be its implementation. It's as simple as that. And I think Labour will be judged by their response to this. I thought that the statement that the Prime Minister gave in Parliament yesterday was extremely powerful, and accepting responsibility of the duty of the state to protect people's lives and how that was systematically failed. But they have got to now follow on those words, those good words, I thought, but with proper action.
If there's any guide to whether this is in any way over, I spoke to two bereaved women. They both lost their brother, about the report. Very, very difficult interview for them to do. So I rang them today just to thank them for their time, and they both said, it's sad, but I'm sure we'll talk again because this isn't over. Yeah. And I think that's where the bereavement survivors are left. They know there's still an awful long way to go.
Thank you all very much indeed. That is this week's Political Forecast. Until next time, bye-bye.